The dust of the Texas plain hung in the late afternoon air, a fine golden haze suspended in the heat. It was September 1943. A line of men in faded, dusty Afrika Korps tunics, their skin leathered by the North African sun, shuffled forward in the alien stillness of a camp compound near Hereford. The only sounds were the scuff of boots on dry earth, the distant call of a crow, and the clatter of metal from the mess hall. These were soldiers of the German Wehrmacht, now prisoners of war, thousands of miles from the fronts they knew. Their world had narrowed to this: a grid of barracks, a wire fence, and the silent scrutiny of American guards who seemed to them unnervingly casual. Their queue led to a serving window, expecting the thin broth and black bread of their own army's rear echelons, or worse, the starvation rations they knew were being inflicted on Soviet prisoners in the East. They watched as GIs behind the counter worked with brisk efficiency. Then the surprise. Onto each man's tray slid not a meager portion, but a full, heavy, olive drab can. Meat and vegetable stew, the label read. Alongside it came a pack of crackers, a bar of chocolate, a packet of cigarettes, and a small precious bar of soap. The prisoners stared, their hands hesitating. This was not sustenance. This was an abundance. This was unmistakably the complete rationale of the United States Army. A deep, unsettling bewilderment passed through the line. The propaganda promises of a weak, decadent enemy, crumbling from within, collided silently with the tangible weight of American provision. In that moment, within the confines of a POW camp, a different kind of war began. The wire fences defined the physical limits of their world, but the contents of that region would begin to dismantle the ideological walls they had carried across an ocean. To understand the profound disorientation of that Texan afternoon, one must first comprehend the journey that brought these men to the American heartland and the vast chasm between the collapsing German war economy and the burgeoning industrial might of the United States. The story begins not in Texas, but in the scorching deserts of North Africa. By May 1943, the Axis forces in Tunisia, encircled and battered by Allied armies, faced total collapse. The surrender that followed was catastrophic for the German High Command. Over 275,000 Axis soldiers, the majority from the veteran Deutsches Afrika Korps and Italian units, laid down their arms. It was a capitulation of Stalingrad-like proportions for the Mediterranean theater. The Allies, however, now faced a colossal logistical problem of their own. What to do with 250,000 prisoners? North Africa lacked the facilities to house them securely, and shipping them to a battered, ration-starved Britain was politically and practically fraught. The solution was audacious in its scale. The United States, its homeland untouched by war's physical devastation, would take them. Under the provisions of the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, to which both Germany and the United States were signatories, captors were obligated to provide sustenance and shelter comparable to that of their own depot troops. For the United States, this meant a standard far beyond anything the prisoners, or indeed most of the world, could now imagine. The transatlantic movement of these men became the largest prisoner transfer in history. Crammed into the holds of Liberty ships, former members of Rommel's elite force made the 2-week crossing, not to a Europe of barbed wire and deprivation, but to the pristine harbors of New York and Norfolk. Their first glimpses of America were staggering. Undamaged skylines, fat merchant ships crowding anchorages, and an atmosphere of calm, purposeful industry. It was a visual shock that preceded the culinary one. They were processed, deloused, given medical exams, and then loaded onto trains with shaded windows, a security measure that only heightened the mystery. As these trains rolled for days into the continent's vast interior, the German prisoners pondered their fate. Nazi ideology had painted a specific picture of their captors: a mongrel people, softened by democracy and jazz, racially inferior, and fundamentally weak. Their propaganda spoke of an America riven by social strife, its economy a hollow shell, its soldiers incompetent. Yet the view from the train windows, however fragmented, told a different story. They saw endless fields of unharvested plenty, sprawling factory complexes billowing smoke, and towns that showed no sign of wartime austerity. The contrast with a Germany now subject to relentless bombing, where every scrap of food was rationed, and the home front was tightening its belt for totaler Krieg, total war, was silently, profoundly unsettling. The system built to receive them was a monumental feat of logistics. The U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General, tasked with this unexpected mission, orchestrated the construction and operation of a network of over 500 base and branch camps across 46 states. Many were built in the rural South and Southwest, where space was abundant and the climate allowed for year-round outdoor labor, a key component of the program. These were not the grim stalags of the European imagination. They were orderly complexes of wooden barracks with electric lighting, running water, and coal-fired heating, laid out in precise military grids. Each was a self-contained village with its own hospital, library, recreational fields, and workshops. For the American government, this represented a pragmatic investment. It adhered to international law, utilized prisoner labor for agriculture and industry to offset costs, and aimed to keep the prisoners peacefully occupied. But for the newly arrived German soldier, stepping off the train into the dry heat of Arizona or the humid flatlands of Florida, this environment was inexplicable. Where was the expected brutality? Where was the starvation? The very architecture of their captivity spoke of a nation operating from a position of impossible, almost careless strength. The stage was now set. The guards were in place, the compounds were full, and the first meals were being prepared. The deliberate, policy-driven reality of American abundance was about to meet the hardened, propaganda-fed expectations of the Third Reich's warriors, with the issued ration as the primary point of contact. For the individual German soldier, a Feldwebel from Hamburg, a Panzergrenadier from Bavaria, the experience was a series of layered, deepening bewilderments. Capture in Tunisia meant the end of combat, but the beginning of a profound uncertainty. The Atlantic crossing in the darkened hold of a ship was claustrophobic and tense, rumors of Allied submarines a grim irony. Stepping onto American soil, they were processed not with violence, but with a bureaucratic organization, almost clinical efficiency, fingerprints, photographs, and medical checks. The absence of expected brutality was, in itself, a form of psychological pressure. They arrived at the camp as warriors from a culture that venerated hardness, sacrifice, and the Führerprinzip, leader principle, now thrusting to a system that was, by their standards, shockingly soft and impersonal. Their personal belongings, save for essential items, were cataloged and stored. They were issued POW uniforms, often denim work clothes dyed a deep blue or khaki, marked with the letters PW. But more importantly, they were issued a mess kit. As they stood in that first chow line, their internal world was a tumult of propaganda and lived experience. They had been told the Americans were weak, their society corrupt. Yet, the guards were tall, well-fed, and equipped with pristine weapons and uniforms. The camp itself was clean and orderly, not a squalid pit. Then came the food. For many, the first sight of the white bread was a shock. In Germany, white flour was a rare luxury. The canned meat was not a gristly scrap, but a substantial chunk. The real coffee, the real chocolate, the cigarettes, these were items that had vanished from the German home front. To receive them as a prisoner felt illogical, even suspicious. Some initially feared the food was poisoned or adulterated, a trick of a deceitful enemy. Others wondered if it was a fleeting gesture for the cameras. But as the days turned to weeks, and the rations remained consistently full and of high quality, a slow cognitive recalibration began. The most powerful propaganda was not broadcast on a radio. It was served on a tin plate 3 times a day. The provision of these rations was not an act of spontaneous generosity. It was the output of a cool, calculating, and breathtakingly capable logistical organism. The U.S. Army Quartermaster Corps and the Provost Marshal General's office faced a problem of staggering scale. At its peak, the continental U.S. held over 425,000 Axis POWs. Feeding them to Geneva standards was a national enterprise. Contracts flowed to American farmers and canneries. Trains carrying cattle, wheat, and vegetables moved not only to ports for shipment overseas, but to sidings near the POW camps. The camps themselves were often located in agricultural regions specifically so the prisoners could work as labor, harvesting the very crops that would eventually feed them and the nation, offsetting the cost of their captivity. The system was designed to be self-sustaining and morale-neutralizing. Board prisoners were problematic prisoners. Well-fed, occupied prisoners were manageable. The rations were thus a tool of camp administration. The menus were carefully calibrated, not to pamper, but to maintain health and prevent unrest. Nutritionists ensured the diet met caloric needs for the work details many prisoners were assigned to, from logging in Maine to picking cotton in Mississippi. The inclusion of cigarette packs was particularly astute. Cigarettes became the camp currency, lubricating the internal economy of the compounds, allowing prisoners to trade for sundries or privileges, and providing a controllable vice. This systemic approach turned the POW population from a pure burden into a partially productive asset, while simultaneously upholding the letter of international law. Every can of stew, every bar of soap, represented the smooth functioning of a machine that Germany could no longer match, a machine that could provision both its own troops and its captured enemies without apparent strain, a silent testament to industrial and agricultural dominance that no Nazi propaganda screed could effectively counter. Within the prisoner population, a fierce, silent struggle erupted, one dictated by the very rations they consumed. The camps housed a spectrum of political allegiance, from ardent Nazis and SS men to apolitical conscripts and covert anti-fascists. For the true believers, the Überzeugungstäter, conviction perpetrators, and the indoctrinated young, the American abundance was not a kindness, but a weapon, a corrosive, seductive threat. Their ideology was built on a foundation of Spartan hardness, racial struggle, and contempt for the materialistic, decadent democracies. The comfortable barracks and full rations were evidence of that very decadence, but it was a decadence that fed and sheltered them. This created a profound cognitive dissonance. Nazi loyalists, often maintaining a shadow hierarchy within the camps, warned their comrades against the poison of American goodwill. They framed the good treatment as a trick, a soft manipulation designed to break their ideological spirit. Some initially refused the chocolate or threw away the cigarettes, seeing them as corrupting influences. They preached continued loyalty to the Endsieg, final victory, and scorned those who interacted freely with guards or showed appreciation. However, the daily, tangible evidence of a system that worked, where food was plentiful, where guards followed rules rather than whims, slowly eroded the credibility of the hardliners. The propaganda of strength rang hollow in the face of an enemy who could afford to be soft without being weak. For many younger prisoners, especially those who had been fed a diet of Nazi ideology since the Hitler Jugend, the camp experience became a forced, real-world education. The contrast between the Nazi promise of a racially ordered utopia, now visibly collapsing in Europe, and the functional, prosperous pluralism of America, was served to them on a tray 3 times daily. The mess hall became, unintentionally, a classroom for deprogramming. The American approach was never naive. It was a cold, strategic calculation forged at the highest levels of the War Department. Key figures like Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall were adamant the United States would strictly adhere to the Geneva Convention. This stance served multiple, overlapping strategic aims. Primarily, it was a direct form of insurance. Thousands of American airmen were parachuting into German hands. By establishing a clear standard of treatment, the U.S. sought to create a framework for reciprocity, giving the Swiss protectors, the neutral intermediaries, a firm basis to demand equivalent conditions for Allied POWs in Germany. Beyond this immediate quid pro quo, the policy was a long-term investment in psychological warfare and post-war reconstruction. The soft power of full rations and fair treatment was meant to demoralize the enemy rank and file by showcasing American invincibility and magnanimity. It was a message aimed not just at the prisoners, but at Germany itself, as letters home describing the conditions circulated through the Reich, undermining the Nazi narrative of a struggling foe. Furthermore, American planners were already looking past the war's end. They envisioned a need to rebuild Germany, to prevent a repeat of the vengeful bitterness that followed Versailles. By treating prisoners humanely, They sought to plant seeds of future reconciliation, to demonstrate that the coming peace would be based on rules and rehabilitation, not annihilation. The ration, therefore, was more than food. It was a diplomatic note, a propaganda leaflet, and a blueprint for the future, all contained within a tin can. It represented a form of warfare where the ultimate victory was not just over armies, but over minds, aiming to convince the enemy that surrender to such a power was not a descent into barbarism, but a step back into the civilized world. These four angles, the personal disorientation, the systemic might, the ideological collision, and the strategic calculation, converged at the moment the ration was issued. This moment, repeated hundreds of thousands of times across America, formed the quiet, daily turning point of this unique chapter of the war. The climax was not a single explosive event, but the cumulative, psychological impact of this sustained, tangible contradiction. The climax of this story is not marked by the thunder of guns, but by the metallic clunk of a can being placed on a tray, the rustle of waxed paper, and the slow, deliberate process of consumption. It was a turning point measured in calories and cognitive dissonance, unfolding in mess halls from the pine forests of Wisconsin to the swamps of Louisiana. The decisive moment occurred when the abstract policy of humane treatment became, for the German prisoner, an inescapable, daily physical reality that his pre-existing worldview could not explain away. This was the moment expectation shattered against fact. Consider the specific components, each a small shock in itself. The C ration can, heavy and substantial. A prisoner would puncture it with his issued P38 can opener, a tool many had never seen, to find inside a thick stew of beef, potatoes, carrots, and peas in a rich gravy. The meat was not a stringy, gristly fragment, but recognizable chunks. The biscuits, hardtack, were bland, but they were solid, shelf-stable carbohydrates. Then came the accessories. The D-bar, a dense chocolate formulation meant for energy. The pack of cigarettes, often Lucky Strikes or Camels with their iconic logos. A packet of instant coffee or lemon powder. And perhaps most astonishingly, chewing gum or a small bar of soap. This was not mere sustenance. It was a kit for maintaining a semblance of civilian habit and hygiene in the field, now extended to the captive. The initial reactions were a study in suspicion and disbelief. In Camp Trinidad, Colorado, prisoners were seen meticulously dissecting their first meals, poking at the contents as if searching for hidden tricks. In Camp Forest, Tennessee, rumors swept the barracks that the rich food was an American plot to make them sick, to soften them up for interrogation. Some hardened Nazis, true to their ideology, initially refused or traded away the chocolate and cigarettes, viewing them as symbols of corrupting pleasure. But hunger and consistency are powerful forces. As the days passed and the rations kept coming, unchanged, undiminished, the suspicion gave way to a reluctant, then routine, acceptance. The guards played a crucial, often understated role in this psychological pivot. They were under orders not to fraternize, but their casual demeanor and occasional comments were telling. A guard might nod at a prisoner's can and say, "Same thing we got for lunch," a simple statement of fact that carried immense weight. The parity was visible. Guards ate from the same stocks, from the same kitchens. There was no separate, inferior line for the prisoners. This visible equality of provision was a silent sermon on the American ethos. It communicated that the rules applied to everyone, that their basic humanity was not forfeit upon capture. For men steeped in a hierarchy that deemed certain races, Untermenschen, subhumans, unworthy of life. This baseline respect was revolutionary. The true turning point crystallized in the act of eating itself. The taste of real sugar, real coffee, real beef, flavors that had become distant memories for many since the war began, triggered a visceral, emotional response. Diaries and post-war accounts speak of this with a kind of awe. The physical satisfaction of a full stomach, a sensation many had not felt in months of desert campaigning and transatlantic transit, began to dismantle the propaganda of a struggling America. How could a nation that could not feed itself produce this? How could a weak, disunited people organize such a flawless, global system of supply? The questions arose not from lectures, but from the direct sensory experience of chewing and swallowing. The enemy's strength was not just in his machines, it was in his land, his harvest, his logistics. It was a strength so deep he could share it with those he had defeated. This daily ritual in the mess hall became the central, quiet battleground. The Nazi hardliners recognized the threat. They attempted to enforce ideological purity by condemning those who enjoyed the rations or showed gratitude. In some camps, they even organized covert food protests, urging men to complain about the cooking as a means of maintaining defiance. But these efforts often faltered. The fundamental human need for nourishment and the sheer quality of that nourishment proved a more powerful force than political dogma. The American policy was not trying to make friends, it was demonstrating an unassailable truth about power and resources. And with each meal, that truth became harder to deny. The climax deepened and solidified, not in a single event, but through comparative experience and the powerful medium of letters home. As the prisoners settled into the rhythm of camp life, they encountered further layers of the American system that reinforced the initial shock of the rations. Work details took them outside the wire under guard to farms, canneries, and logging operations. Here, they saw the source of the abundance firsthand: endless fields of grain, orchards heavy with fruit, herds of well-fed cattle. They worked alongside American civilians, farmers, foremen, who often treated them not as monstrous Nazis, but as strong, available labor. Payment was in canteen coupons, allowing them to purchase additional goods like beer, writing paper, or even musical instruments through the camp store. This immersion in the undamaged, productive American landscape was a continuous revelation. The war felt distant, abstract, while the evidence of peaceful prosperity was immediate and tangible. The most potent catalyst for the internal turning point, however, was the mail. The Geneva Convention guaranteed prisoners the right to send and receive letters, and the U.S. authorities, following their policy to the letter, facilitated this exchange through the International Red Cross. Prisoners received letters from home, describing a starkly different reality. Wives and mothers wrote of the relentless Allied bombing, of homes destroyed, of the desperate scramble for food using ever-dwindling ration coupons. They described the Kohl-Reuben winter, turnip winter, the ersatz everything, the gnawing hunger. They asked, with heartbreaking hope, if their sons and husbands could spare any food from their own provisions. This correspondence created a moral and psychological chasm. The prisoner, sitting in a warm barracks in Oklahoma with a full stomach and a pack of Lucky Strikes in his pocket, read about his family's suffering. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. He was living better as a prisoner in America than his own family was as free citizens in the fortress of Europe. This realization was the final, crushing blow to the Nazi narrative of national solidarity and strength through sacrifice. How could the Vaterland be superior when it could not feed its own? How could the Volksgemeinschaft, people's community, be a success when his capture had led to a higher standard of living? The guilt was often profound, but so was the dawning understanding. The letters home that they then wrote became instruments of unintended psychological warfare. They described their rations in detail, sometimes even enclosing a cigarette or a sliver of chocolate in the envelope. Tiny, illegal, powerful tokens of the truth. These letters, circulating through the German postal system, became subversive documents. They were tangible proof that the enemy's promises were empty and the enemy's abundance was real. Within the camps, a subtle social realignment began. The authority of the Nazi camp leaders and hardliners eroded as their predictions of American cruelty or trickery failed to materialize. The focus of the prisoners shifted from ideological resistance to practical adaptation. They organized sports leagues, formed orchestras and theater groups, and pursued education through the surprisingly well-stocked camp libraries, which included texts on American history and democracy that were not censored. The energy once reserved for maintaining fanatical loyalty was redirected toward personal betterment and simple survival in a system that, while confining, was predictable and safe. The American Guards, observing this transition, noted the decline in escape attempts, which were seen as futile given the geographic reality and the general atmosphere of calm compliance. The rations had done their work. They had created a stable, manageable population not through fear but through the demoralizing, disarming power of undeniable plenty. The turning point was thus complete. It was the moment the German prisoner, on a deep and personal level, stopped seeing himself as a temporarily inconvenienced warrior of a superior ideology and began to see himself as a bystander to and beneficiary of a global conflict whose outcome was now preordained by economic and industrial facts he could taste and touch. The war for his mind had been won not with bullets, but with butter, beef, and the bitter contrast between his full mess kit and his family's empty larder. The shock of the ration evolved into a settled, somber acceptance of a new reality, setting the stage for the unique and often paradoxical aftermath of their captivity. This internal, collective shift prepares us to examine the consequences, what life became in the long years of captivity, and what legacy this unprecedented experiment in humane imprisonment would leave on both the prisoners and their captors. The sustained policy of humane treatment and full rations created a unique and paradoxical society behind the wire. A peaceful captivity that lasted, for many, until 1946 and beyond. The war in Europe ended in May 1945, but the logistical and political challenge of repatriating over 400,000 men to a shattered continent meant most remained in the United States for another year, even two. This extended period allowed the initial shock to solidify into a lasting, transformative experience. Life in the camps developed its own cultural rhythm, becoming a strange interlude between the trauma of war and an uncertain future. The prisoners, their basic needs met beyond expectation, channeled their energies into remarkable acts of self-organization and creativity. Camp newspapers like Der Wacher, The Watchtower at Camp McCain, Mississippi, or Die Baraka. The barracks at Camp Hearn, Texas, were professionally printed, featuring poetry, essays, and camp news. Symphony orchestras performed Beethoven and Mozart on instruments ordered from Sears Roebuck catalogs. Theater troupes staged elaborate productions of German classics and even wrote original plays. In Camp Concordia, Kansas, prisoners built elaborate, scale-model Bavarian villages complete with running water, a display of craftsmanship and nostalgia that attracted visits from curious locals. Universities extended correspondence courses, and many prisoners learned English, studied engineering, or earned degrees. This flourishing of culture was matched by the economic impact of their labor. Over 90% of eligible POWs worked on paid details, primarily in agriculture. They harvested sugar beets in the Midwest, picked peaches in Georgia, chopped cotton in Texas, and logged timber in the Pacific Northwest. This labor was not slave labor. They were paid 80 cents a day in canteen coupons, a rate set by the Geneva Convention. For American farmers facing a crippling manpower shortage, these disciplined, skilled workers were a godsend. The relationship that developed was often one of mutual respect and even camaraderie. Prisoners were frequently invited to share meals with farm families, experiences that further humanized the enemy on both sides. This daily interaction outside the wire was perhaps the most powerful denazification program of all. An unscripted, personal diplomacy over a farmhouse lunch. Yet the experience was not uniform or without its dark undercurrents. The camps remained tense ecosystems where the ideological divide between Nazis and anti-Nazis, or the politically indifferent, could turn violent. In severe cases, like at Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, a prisoner suspected of being an informant for the Americans was murdered by Nazi loyalists. The U.S. authorities eventually responded by segregating the hardcore Nazis into special camps, like Camp Alva in Oklahoma, where stricter discipline could be maintained. For the majority, However, the overwhelming daily reality was one of boring routine, loneliness, and the psychological strain of being a well-fed captive while one's homeland was destroyed. They were observers to the collapse of their world through censored newsreels and letters, living in a comfortable limbo that itself induced a kind of survivor's guilt. The good treatment did not erase the stigma of defeat or the anxiety about returning to a bombed-out, occupied Germany, where their status as former POWs of the Americans might be viewed with suspicion. The end of the war in Europe did not bring immediate jubilation in the camps. For many, it brought a profound depression and a new fear of Soviet captivity. A significant number of prisoners, particularly those from Eastern Germany, pleaded not to be repatriated, terrified of being handed over to the Red Army. The United States, bound by agreements made at the Yalta Conference, was forced to repatriate all prisoners, a process that caused significant anguish and, in some notorious cases, near the end of the war, violent resistance during forced transfers to Soviet control. For those returning to what would become the Western occupation zones, however, the journey back began the final phase of their re-education. They returned not as emaciated, broken survivors, but as healthy men carrying duffel bags sometimes filled with goods from the canteen, their physical condition a silent testament to their treatment. The repatriation of German POWs from the United States was a reverse migration of a transformed population. Between 1945 and 1947, they boarded ships not as the defeated Afrika Korps of 1943, but as men who had lived for years inside the American mirror. They disembarked in a Europe of ruins, a visceral, shocking contrast to the intact world they had left. Many arrived in Bremerhaven, a shattered port city, to a homeland where the currency was worthless, food was scarcer than during the war, and the social order was inverted under Allied occupation. Their robust health and the tangible goods they brought, American cigarettes, coffee, chocolate, even cans of preserved rations, immediately made them stand out. These items became priceless currency on the black market, often providing the crucial seed capital for their families to survive the hunger years. Their personal testimonies became a critical, subversive force in post-war Germany. As they reunited with families and communities, they told stories that directly contradicted the lingering Nazi myths and the emerging Soviet-led narrative of American imperialism. They spoke of fair treatment, of full stomachs, of guards who followed rules. They described a land of unbelievable, almost offensive plenty. This first-hand account played a significant, though often unheralded, role in the early psychological orientation of West Germany toward the Western Allies. It provided a human foundation for the political and economic reorientation to come. When the Marshall Plan was announced in 1947, offering massive American aid for reconstruction, it did not seem an alien or suspicious concept to those who had already experienced American largesse on a personal, albeit captive, scale. They had seen the engine of that generosity up close. For the United States, the POW program was retrospectively viewed as an unequivocal success. It had upheld the Geneva Convention, likely improving conditions for American POWs in Germany. It had provided vital agricultural labor at home. Most importantly, it had served as a long-term, immersive lesson in American values for hundreds of thousands of Germans who would become central to rebuilding their nation. The cost was substantial, nearly $1 billion in 1940s dollars, but it was seen as an investment in a stable post-war order. The program left a physical legacy as well. Many camp facilities were converted into housing for returning American GIs or into new educational institutions, a final transformation from places of confinement to places of new beginnings. The long-term impact on the prisoners themselves was complex and deeply personal. Many maintained a lifelong, if ambivalent, gratitude toward the United States. Veteran associations of former POWs held reunions in America decades later, visiting the sites of their captivity. They corresponded with former guards and the families of farmers they worked for. For some, the experience fundamentally reshaped their worldview, leading them to embrace democratic principles and become active in fostering German-American friendship. For others, It remained a confusing interlude, a time of comfort tinged with shame for having been treated well while their countrymen suffered. Almost universally, however, they recognized the profound dissonance that had defined their captivity. They had been defeated by a system whose strength was expressed not in cruelty, but in a capacity for routine kindness, rooted in overwhelming power. The verifiable data underscores the starkness of the contrast. While over 1.1 million German POWs in Western Allied captivity, excluding the Soviets, died, a mortality rate of about 1 to 2%. The rate for German POWs held in the United States was approximately 0.15%, largely due to illness or accident, not mistreatment. They gained an average of 12 to 15 pounds in captivity. This statistical reality, more than any anecdote, captures the essence of the aftermath. An experiment in controlled humanity that, by adhering to a code, achieved a strategic victory that lasted long after the fences came down. The guards had not just watched over prisoners. They had, through the simple, consistent act of issuing standard rations, become inadvertent ambassadors for a world their charges would soon have to help build. The quiet climax of the mess hall led to this sprawling historical aftermath, a legacy of health, transformed perspectives, and a foundational chapter in the reconciliation between two nations. It sets the stage for a final reflection on what this unique episode tells us about the nature of warfare, power, and the rules that can, even in total war, hold civilization together.